Today we will be talking about one of two important ethical traditions that come out of the absolutist camp in ethics. Deontological ethics focuses on intention or duties that we may have to other people. So, why are we talking about deontological ethics, which began during the time of Kant over 200 years ago in a biomedical ethics class today? Well, deontological ethics encapsulate several important components of ethical decision making in the medical sphere. First, as there is a professional ethic, duty plays an important role. Second, because people tend to focus on intentions, in deontological ethics highlight how intentions matter in ethics. So you can think of an experience that you may have had where a friend may have intended to cause harm to you, maybe hurting your reputation, etc. Even if that didn't come to pass, that may have felt like an ethical wrong, right? The person is intending to harm me. Deontological ethics sort of encapsulate how intentions can be ethically problematic and how good intentions should be cultivated, at least under this view. So class today will be structured as follows. I will be providing a brief introduction of Kantian ethics. Kant was the one who first founded this camp of deontological ethics. And then we'll be talking about how Kantian ethics formed the foundation for the principle of autonomy. Again, the why. Well, again, Kantian and deontological ethics more generally are the basis for this principle of autonomy. And as we'll talk about when we look at autonomy more specifically, this is one of the premier ethical principles in medical context today. Respecting the choices of your patients and research subjects is key to acting ethically in medicine. And it also illustrates again how intentions matter in ethics and for some decision makers. It matters for many people whether or not you intend to benefit them, harm them, etc. Now, on Friday, we'll explore consequentialist positions. And I wish there's a little picture of me on the side because I would show you my hands like sort of coming together in conflict, right? Because there are two warring camps. So I don't want to say warring, but sort of camps that hold very different views in absolutist ethics. On the one camp, there are people like Kant and other deontological ethicists who argue that what matters is intention. Whether or not an action is ethical, it can be determined based on whether or not you intended to harm a person. Whereas on the other camp, we have the consequentialists. And the consequentialists argue that consequences matter, that it doesn't matter what your intentions are. All that matters is what actually occurs. Did you hit the car? Did you not hit the car? Did you cause harm? Did you not cause harm? Right? So on Friday, we'll be looking at these consequentialist approaches, specifically egoism and utilitarianism and Epicureanism as well. We'll just throw in a third one there. But today we're going to focus on deontological ethics. Okay, so deontology was first, or this ethical approach was first created by Immanuel Kant. Immanuel Kant lived, he was born in 1724 and he lived until 1804. He did not get out much. It is the stories say that he never left his hometown. He was highly influential in ethics, and he still is. He is one of the last philosophers to form an entire system of philosophy. You could imagine what his dissertation looked like. And not only is he influential in ethics and bioethics, but he influenced the sociology of Max Weber, the psychology of Jean Piaget, and the linguistics of Noam Chomsky. So, very important thinker here. As a little story, the townspeople of the small town that he never left, it's said that they could set their watch by his routine because he was so focused on keeping a specific routine that the Townspeople always knew where he would be at every part of the day. So an interesting guy there. Yeah, never married, etc. So, Kant's deontological ethics, in order to better understand the framework and how he argues for his position, it's important to recognize that he accepts certain assumptions about the world, and this forms the foundation for his ethical theory. He views humans as rational and thus were intrinsically valuable. So he separates humans from other animals, a la Aristotle here as well, by arguing that out of all of the other animals in the animal kingdom, humans are different because we have the capacity to reason. We can think about the future, we can analyze past events, and we can determine what the best course of action is. We have what's called second and third order thought, to draw from some of the cognitive literature or the philosophy of mind literature as well. And Kant's like, okay, so humans are rational. We have this great capacity. And because we can make choices, because we can think about the future, because we can think about the past, we are valuable. There's something that is important about being able to have that capacity that makes us unique and therefore valuable. And we should respect that. What's right for me using my reason is right for everyone. So he viewed moral laws akin to natural law. And he thought that, okay, well, we live in societies that can run well, depending on the rules that we follow, or it could run poorly if we're not following rules that sort of tend to push society in a way that would tend to push society in a way that could be problematic for the larger structure. So he thinks that we can use our rational abilities, use reason, to identify ethical rules that everyone should follow, right? So what's right for me using my reason is right for everyone else. And if you are reasoning properly or correctly for Kant, you will come to the same conclusion that everyone else will, right? You'll be able to identify these moral laws that are akin to natural laws. And here, natural laws can be understood as inherent, having a basis in nature and reality and truth, and they're not caused by human. And there's something separate. There are some ideal laws about the nature of reality, right? And all we need to do then, in order to identify the ethical thing to do, is use our reason, this special ability that we have, to identify these moral laws that are akin to natural laws, and then put them into place and follow them. All done. Ethics is finished. Boom. So that's Kant's general position concerning morality and ethics more general. So moral obligations are found using reason. So, okay, well, that seems like it's an interesting way to go. I mean, it seems like, Piaget liked it and Noam Chomsky, so it seems like there might be something to this position. So what are these natural laws or principles that we should follow then? Like Kant seems like he's, he definitely identified reason as an important thing and he's applying it. So what does he think that these universal laws are? Well, we utilize reason to find those duties that we ought to do versus actions that are guided by our desires. So he separates reasons into two camps: imperatives and, categorical imperatives and hypothetical imperatives. So an imperative is a tense. You can think of an imperative as a command. Stop kicking me, pay your taxes, etc. Right? So when Kant says a categorical imperative, he's talking about commands that we should follow. So a categorical imperative is one type of action, and these are things that we ought to do morally. The other type of action he calls hypothetical imperatives, and these are things that we should do based on specific contexts. So he argues that we can use reason to separate the categorical imperatives, which are moral laws, so to speak, a la natural laws, um, from the hypothetical imperatives, which are simply commands that we follow, or directions more generally that we follow in certain contexts, right? So, because an imperative is a command, categorical imperatives, you can think of categories here, are commands that we follow unconditionally. They're categorical. In whatever context we are in, we follow them. Don't cheat on your taxes. He would argue, don't lie. Well, don't cheat on your taxes is not his. He never specifically discussed taxes, but he did discuss lying, murder, etc. So one of the categorical imperatives that he found was this idea that you should not lie. And we'll get into the maxims that he identified and how this sort of lends itself to more general rules. So you have these commands that you follow unconditionally, a la categorical imperatives, and then you have the conditional commands, and these are called hypothetical imperatives. And these imperatives command conditionally on you having relevant desire. So, for example, it's an if-then statement. If you want to go to medical school, that's the hypothetical, right? Study biology or bioethics in college. So in this instance, we have the hypothetical, which is the if you want to, blah. And then we have what follows. Then we have the command that you should follow. Study biology. So for Kant, hypothetical imperatives are not ethical mandates. They're not moral law. So how do we separate categorical from hypothetical imperatives? And what is the connection between morality and categorical imperatives? Well, Kant is like, okay, so we have these two commands that we follow. Using reason, we can identify them. And, they both seem like they're giving us pretty good advice here, right? But we should focus on following categorical rather than hypothetical imperatives because A, morality is such that you are commanded by it, hence the imperative. You need to follow something. It's deontology, duty-based ethic. And morality should be something that you cannot opt out of or claim that it doesn't apply to you, right? If it's going to be a moral law, then it shouldn't be contingent on context for Kant. It shouldn't be something that you can opt out of. It shouldn't be like, I won't lie tomorrow. In this context, it's perfectly fine to lie. That context, no. It should hold for all citizens at all times. So Kant argues that it doesn't matter whether you want to be moral or not. Remember here, it's a moral law. Moral law is binding on all of us. Right? So when we're in, no matter what situation we are in for Kant, once we identify these moral laws, we should follow them. So he provides us with two categorical imperatives that we should generally follow that help identify specific courses of action in specific contexts. And these two categorical imperatives, well, he actually gave us more than two in his large treatise, but I'm focusing on just the first two in this lecture. These two, for Kant, will lead us to the exact same result. First, I ought never to act except in such a way that I can also will that my maxim should become a universal law. I ought never to act except in such a way that I can will that my maxim should become a universal law. And this is aimed at separating the hypothetical imperatives from the categorical imperatives. So he pushes us to think about society. If we act in such a way, such as lying, let's say we want to lie in a situation, or we want to steal. Let's say, okay, I'm really hungry. That bread looks amazing. And I'm like, but I don't have any money. So I'm just going to go and take that bread. Well, he's like, no, wait a minute. Before you do that action, To determine whether it's ethical or not, think about the first categorical imperative. I ought never to act except in such a way that I can also will my maxims should become universal law. So, what would society look like if everyone stole? If nobody paid for anything and everyone took that loaf of bread? That would be thinking of stealing as becoming a universal law that everyone needs to follow. So, for Kant, society would break down in that situation, right? It wouldn't work. If everyone accepted that stealing was okay, then stealing would no longer be stealing. In this instance, there would be an internal, an illogical conflict here. So, in that way, Kant would argue that stealing then violates the categorical imperative and it's not the ethical thing to do. More generally, although this is separating sort of out from Kant a bit because he's focused on logical consistency rather than social implications more specifically, but you can think of it, at least as a thought experiment. Would society break down or would it not break down, right? If everyone thought that stealing was okay, in that instance, it couldn't act as a universal law because societies would not be able to function properly if everyone thought stealing was okay. Although, again, right, that's a step away from Kant's focus on logical consistency. But I think it's still a rough and ready way of thinking about how categorical imperatives can help us. Now, the second rendition of the categorical imperative is act in such a way that you should always treat humanity as never simply a means, but always an end in themselves. And this is important for biomedical ethics. Right? Act in such a way that you always treat humanity as never simply a means, but always an end in themselves. So Kant argues that in addition to thinking about our actions as if they were universally accepted, and whether or not we want to live in a world like that or whether or not it's logically consistent, another way to identify the right action or these moral laws is to think about the other people that we're interacting with. Are we treating these other people as a means to an end or as an end in themselves, right? So when I go to get coffee and I would talk with the barista, am I treating the barista as simply a means to obtaining coffee? Or am I recognizing that the barista has the capacity to reason? She is or he is unique and inherently valuable. Am I treating the barista as an end in herself? So when we think about actions, should I take the bread? Am I treating the baker as simply a means of obtaining the bread? Or am I respecting the baker as an end in him or herself, or her and himself, that, has desires, intuitions, wants, and can reason as well? Am I respecting that person? So Kant argues that both of these renditions of the categorical imperative can help us identify rules for living our lives and help us to identify what is right action, what are our duties, and what is problematic action. So this places, at least with the second rendition of the categorical imperative, places autonomy at the forefront of ethical consideration. And it helps us to identify key ethical duties. And I just want to read this quote. We're not mere objects that exist to be used by others. We are our own ends. We're rational and autonomous. We have the ability to set our own goals and work towards them. End quote. Right? So 1704 to 1800, we're seeing the shift in ethical thought where autonomy and the ability to make decisions is connected to ethics and is an important component of ethics, right? So autonomy is coming to the forefront of ethical consideration. And as we fast forward, when we saw the Nuremberg Code, we see the Belmont Report, here autonomy once again and again and again is being highlighted as an important component that deserves ethical consideration. And part of the reason why we're going quickly over Kantian ethics is it's important to see where this is coming from. And also, you can think of the second categorical imperative as sort of connecting to an older ethical rule of thumb or the golden rule as well. So, this capacity, this ability to choose, ability to make decisions, is of ethical importance and is coming out of this tradition. All right, so the categorical imperative for Kant leads us to these ethical rules that we should follow, and he argues that they lead us to universal principles. So he argues that we should do only those actions that conform to rules that could be adopted universally, as we were talking about in the previous slide. If you should be able to do it, then everyone should be able to do it. And we talked about stealing, etc. This slide highlights his argumentation supporting that position. However, you do not need to worry about this. This is just illustrative of the example that we were talking about concerning stealing, etc., in the previous slide. Okay. So for Kant, when we're faced with making a decision, he gives us several action steps. First, what is the maxim, a rule of conduct guiding my action? What if everybody did it? And would it be self-defeating? If it would be self-defeating, don't do it. If it is not self-defeating, then it's acceptable to do that action. So you can think of Kant as giving us, we can think of distilling Kantian theory down into these three action steps. All right, so this is an important video discussing critiques of Kant as well as sort of limitations of the theory. I would, you know what, I'm going to try and show it to you because it's very important.
If a sinister-looking man carrying an axe knocked on your door and asked you where your best friend was, would it be morally acceptable to tell a lie? Immanuel Kant, surprisingly, thought it wouldn't. The example of the would-be murderer is his. An absolute duty, one without exceptions. It applies to everyone, whatever the consequences. In fact, Kant argued that if you told a lie which, by chance, led to the axeman finding your friend, that would be on your conscience. So if you tell the axeman that your friend is not in the house when he is, and your friend then sneaks out the back door and bumps into the axeman, anything that then happens is, to some extent, your responsibility. But if you told the truth, then the consequences for your friend, no matter how grisly, should not be on your conscience. This brings out how different his moral stance was from utilitarianism, the philosophy that you should do whatever brings about the greatest happiness. A utilitarian would think about the consequences of telling the truth or of lying. In contrast, for Kant, some actions were just wrong, even if good consequences might flow from them. This is known as a deontological approach to ethics.
Okay. All right, so in addition to concerns over not taking consequences into account, so as you can see that there is quite the conflict between intention-based or deontological, duty-based ethics and consequential-based ethics because we're looking at the categorical imperative and trying to identify positions utilizing reason alone, there are certain circumstances such as whether or not you steal or lying, etc., that are wrong no matter what the consequences. And for consequentialists, the impacts of your actions are incredibly important and should be taken into account. And so they find, well, they're both concerned with and they find umbrage with, or they're highly critical of deontological ethics. Now, there, in addition to the concern over consequences, another critique of deontological ethics, especially by McIntyre and communitarians and care ethicists, is this idea that, okay, so we need to utilize reason, we need to follow the categorical imperatives, and this will help us identify universal principles that should guide our action. All right. But by focusing on reason and by looking for universal principles that are internally consistent, we're not looking at or we're not recognizing another aspect of lived experience that has ethical considerability, and that's our relationship to other people and to pets, etc. So care ethics implies that there's moral significance in the fundamental elements of relationships and dependencies in human life. You know, I have certain duties. Well, that I follow certain duties, and when I think about my brothers, for example, when I treat my brothers versus other people, there are certain duties that I should follow. Right? I should treat my brothers in certain ways. Respect them, not steal their bikes. Things like that. Although Kant would argue that respecting my brothers and not stealing their bicycles, that's following the categorical imperative. Whereas care ethicists argue that, you know, you have special duties to those that you're in relationships with. So, for example, my dog, this is my dog Turtle, Tortuga, and, I have a special relationship with my dog that's separate from how I interact with dogs that are not my own. If I promise Turtle that I'm going to take her to the park or that I'm going to walk her, etc., then I need to follow that. I have a duty to ensure the well being of my particular dog. That doesn't extend to ensuring the well being of other dogs. Indeed, the owners of other dogs might be quite offended by the fact that I'm showing up at their house and trying to take their dog for a walk. you know? So, care ethicists also push back against deontological ethics due to these relational duties. Okay, I want to leave you with that key part. Why did we look at deontological approaches? Because duty matters in medical contexts, intention matters, because this particular ethic forms the initial justification for treating people as an end in themselves, for prioritizing autonomy. So thank you guys very much. Again, if you have any questions or concerns, let me know.